Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining this webinar from. Thank you for signing up and attending the webinar today, peering into peer review. We have three panelists who all volunteer at ASM at different levels. I'm Anand Balasubramani, a journal development editor here at ASM. And we have a great panel today for all of you to share some insights from Colin Parrish, Diana Proctor, and Christina Cuomo about peer review here at ASM and peer review at large. I'm sure there are several questions all of you have about peer review and what happens in peer review. So hopefully most of these get answered in the panel itself, but if not, please put your questions in the chat. We have folks monitoring the chat who can answer any questions that come up. I'm going to stop sharing the screen and move this to more of a webinar mode. Okay, so I'm going to start by introducing our panelists today, Drs. Colin Parrish, Diana Proctor, and Christina Cuomo. Colin is the John M. Olin Professor of Virology and the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University. His laboratory studies parvoviruses and influenza viruses, and his particular interest in canon influenza viruses. He's currently an editor at the Journal of Virology. Diana Proctor is a postdoctoral fellow at the NIGRI here in Maryland. I'm based in Maryland. She uses whole genome sequencing and shotgun metagenomics to understand the spread of infectious diseases through American nursing homes. She is a recipient of the US EPA Star Fellowship, and she currently serves on MBio's junior editorial board. The editorial board at MBio has a new section called the Junior Board, and Diana is going to tell us a bit more about how that actually works and her experience there. Last but not least is Christina Cuomo. She's a professor at the Department of Molecular Microbiology and Immunology at Brown University. She's a genomics researcher and a mycologist, and her laboratory is interested in understanding virulence and drug resistance mechanisms in fungal pathogens. She is the editor-in-chief of ASM's newest journal, Microbiology Spectrum. Welcome, Colin, Christina, and Diana, and thank you for being ASM volunteers and for volunteering to participate in today's webinar. So I'm going to start off by asking a question that allows all three of them to introduce their roles here at ASM, and then it's going to move into a much more panel-style panel. So Colin, you personally handle submissions for the Journal of Virology. Could you tell us your process for identifying peer reviewers, and do you always actually use peer reviewers recommended by authors at all?
Yeah, so I have a few sort of comments about the peer review process that I thought I would share, just to, I sort of realized that, those of us who've been in the business for a while, kind of take a lot of this for granted. But the first thing is that, we really do welcome, almost everyone to be a peer reviewer. If you're, relatively junior in science, you can often work with your mentor or, your PI to sort of help review papers. And I think, basically I see that, everyone should really consider being involved in the process. And if you're publishing manuscripts, then, generally every manuscript requires 2 or 3 reviewers. So, if you want to volunteer to review, 2 or 3 papers, at least for everyone that you publish, that would be sort of really help to balance the system out. And then the other thing about peer reviewing, and I'm just sort of giving you some background, is that, most of us were never trained to be peer reviewers, or, if we're editors, we never really got sort of a formal training in being an editor. And I think being on a junior panel, as Diana is a really good way to sort of get experience in doing that. But the other thing is, just, look at reviews that you get for your own manuscripts, read them carefully, try to get an insight into, maybe you get 2 or 3 reviews, and, just take sort of an example of what are they doing. If it's a good review, it'll often have sort of a summary of the work at the beginning, sort of, a little bit of a comment on the significance and impact and novelty of the work, and then, often a list of sort of specific, issues that the reviewer sees and how those might be remedied. I would say that at ASM Press and at the Journal of Virology, some manuscripts are discussed by a group of editors initially, and papers may be rejected without review. this is really if they're likely to be unfavorably reviewed or not going to be favorably reviewed by the journal. And so I hope that doesn't happen to you, but if it does, it's sort of it's a process that allows, you and the editors and potential reviewers to sort of save time, and it allows you to move on quickly. If you want to have comments about, why the paper was rejected without review, you're welcome to reach out to the editors, and the editor will sort of share, what the issues might have been that sort of, prevented it from being moved into the review process. The comments that were made by Anand, so the issues are we often get, as editors, we often get papers that are outside our area of expertise or specific expertise. So, finding good reviewers for your paper is a challenge, and sometimes this can really slow down the process. So I would argue, for everyone who's submitting, do put in as many author suggested reviewers as possible, using both the reviewers on the editorial board as you're requested to do. But if you know other people, particularly more diverse or more junior people who might be, experts in the area of your study, then do include them. And it doesn't hurt to add a few more. You don't just have to do the minimum number, but really, the more good reviewers that we have, suggested, not just your friends and, buddies, but people who can really do a thorough job and who are going to give you an honest and detailed review of your work, that would really help us. And then what I do is, so I take the suggested reviewers or other people like do keyword searches or PubMed searches. I look at the references in the paper and try to, then, look for people who have published in the area, who are clearly experts, who are relatively senior, but I'm not really, what I find is that sometimes the more senior the people are, the less likely they are to accept the editorial invitation. So, I try to have a diversity of people, both in terms of career stage and geography, and also, obviously gender and other kinds of diversity. So I do think that, we want, a good group of reviewers. So if you can suggest people, that would be good. It helps to have, an email address, or if someone has an ORCID number, that also helps us to sort of, identify who those people are and make sure that they have the expertise that we're looking for. And then just in terms of, after the review process, you might have a decision, which, if you're lucky, it'll be, accept with a modification, which, generally happens on the second time around. But you might get a kind of a minor modifications, and that's great if you get that. That means that, you're basically there. You just have to make some minor changes. Another decision is often reject without allowing resubmission. And this basically replaces what used to be sort of the major modifications decision. And if you do get the offer to resubmit, then you can consider that to be, we like the work, but it needs a reasonable amount of extra, updating, or maybe a little bit of extra data. ASM journals tend not to ask for like a ton of extra data. There is a separate category for additional experiments, and so that allows you to sort of, fix up gaps, or, address issues that the reviewers raise. And so if you get a reject but allowing resubmission, then do go ahead and consider that as an offer to resubmit, and take that offer. If you get reject with no resubmission allowed, then that's pretty much saying that, the work isn't going to be acceptable, and it's in the form that it's being presented, even if you make additional changes. And then the last thing I would say, at least in Journal of Virology, the reviews are advisory. The editor makes the decision. So you might get 3 reviews, and one of the reviewers says, you have to do this, and the other 2 reviewers say, don't say that. And if you get a decision like that, if you get reviews like that, then do address all the comments. You don't necessarily have to do every additional experiment suggested by the reviewers, but if you don't do a suggested experiment, do address why you didn't address it, and and make sure that you make clear why the manuscript is still sufficiently, complete without doing that additional work. And then the editor, as I said, the reviewers don't, call the final shots. The editor does make that decision. We may send it back to the reviewers to have them check and make sure that, major issues were addressed. But in the end, we try to make the decision based on the consensus of the reviews and the best and our own reading of the manuscript and what makes it an acceptable piece of work. So those are my main comments about what the editor does, at least, how I do it.
Thank you, Colin. Diana, you currently serve on the MBio Junior Editorial Board. And for attendees, there's a link in the chat now. You can apply to the next iteration of this board that opens in October. So how has your experience in this board been? Has it broadened your sense of science itself and the areas you work in?
Sure. So I, like Colin said, started out peer reviewing by co-reviewing manuscripts with my mentor, and subsequently joined the junior editorial board. And I would say that yes, it's the experiences of peer reviewing about a paper every month has broadened my understanding of what, leading scientists in the field perceive to be within the top 10% of science. And so I think, prior to starting peer review, I had a very narrow view of what was in the top 10%. And now that view is starting to broaden. I think my experience on the junior editorial board has taught me a few really important things. Most fundamentally, it has shifted the content that ends up in my peer reviews. And so rather than putting every thought that crosses my mind about what experiments I would do or what I think would make this paper like the best possible paper, I filter my peer review comments through what I think actually must be done in order to improve the scientific rigor of the manuscript. And coming back to some of the comments Colin made, I think a second thing that the junior editorial board has given me is increased confidence in my ability to peer review. So I can see, where there is a consensus among my, with my comments and the other peer reviewers, and then also echoed those same comments by the editor. That helps me understand that, the comments I'm making are on target. And at the same time, the comments that I make that are unique, which when the authors address those comments, fundamentally improve the manuscript, that has shown me a little bit more clearly what my own expertise is and what my unique contributions are. And so I think that the formal training portion where we get editorial feedback as a part of the junior editorial board is really instrumental and very special.
It's great to hear. Again, people can apply to the junior editorial board fairly soon in October. Please save the link and you can check out the profiles of our current junior editorial board members at MBio. Christina, you were involved in the creation of a similar sort of board at Spectrum. And this has really helped us
Yeah, I can jump in here to say that we created the reviewing editor board at Microbiology Spectrum to have a path for early career investigators to become involved in peer reviewing and then progress directly into editing roles. It's a development program within our journal, and we've prioritized providing the reviewing editors feedback based on the reviews that they provide. They regularly take on reviews for the journal and get feedback on those reviews. And importantly, we've started to promote some of the reviewing editors into handling editorial roles. And this is based on their performance in providing reviews for us. And also, importantly, just the subject area needs of the journal where we need to kind of fill holes in the submissions that we're receiving. And we also have really, from the beginning of Spectrum, prioritized diversity as a metric for how we're building the journal that we take into consideration in kind of a holistic measure of how we're building our editorial boards. And as part of that, we've always recruited for editorial roles, both for editors and reviewing editors through open calls. And so if anyone is interested in applying for reviewing editors, you can go to our website and take a look. This is a rolling process that we recruit to our reviewing editor board and appoint people to assist with peer reviewing papers for Spectrum. Also just want to highlight how this is a really diverse group of individuals, even more so than our editors overall. Overall, the editors for Spectrum are, for example, nearly half women, but the reviewing editors are more than half. And the reviewing editors are about 65% represented from outside of the US compared to 57% of the editors. So we really see this as a way that we can achieve an even higher geographical reach and then use that to diversify the pool of editors that we're bringing into the journal.
Thank you, Christina. We're going to come back to geographical reach in a little bit. So this is the question to all of you. We'll start with Colin and then we'll move to Dan and then Christina. What is the most common problem you see in peer review today?
So there's a couple of problems. I think one is that, many reviewers are just, swamped with the number of, requests that they get. So finding additional reviewers is really important, diversifying the people that we ask. So, getting your name onto the editorial boards. And then the other thing is, I think, people need to think of this as a sort of part of the service that we all provide to our community, that, it's like, I don't know, paying taxes or cleaning up after ourselves. It's sort of, we all need to do this. And so if you get a reasonable request to review, then, try to do that. I think it is getting complicated these days. We see a lot of what I consider predatory journals, or journals with a kind of a weak process, and so I think we all get swamped with requests for publications and for reviews, and so picking looking at the serious journals, the ones that really support the community and that publish the better science, I think is important. So it's a challenge, and I think but I think if everyone can help and get involved, it will make everything so much easier.
Diana?
Sure. So as a member of the junior editorial board, several of us co-authored an editorial on what we think the problems are with peer review and how we think they can be solved. And so one problem that Colin mentioned is, the difficulties in finding peer reviewers. And I see many comments in the chat and in the questions about how graduate students and postdocs can become involved in the peer review process. Other problems that are commonly identified include reviewers asking for too many experiments that are outside the scope of either the journal or the manuscript. And then, even more critically, the inability on a manuscript by manuscript basis for reviewers to catch major problems with manuscripts like scientific misconduct, and then those papers eventually needing to go on and get retracted. I think we can encapsulate all of these common problems with peer review under the umbrella of a lack of formal training for how to evaluate science rigorously, how to civilly communicate our concerns about manuscripts. And then these education programs could actually, like the junior editorial boards, form a channel for junior scientists to get involved in the community and gain these experiences.
Christina?
I would echo the points that have been raised by Colin and Diana. Certainly with our editors, finding reviewers is a major challenge that they raise with us. And so yeah, in submitting your papers, I would highly recommend, as has been raised, that you think about appropriate reviewers that are not just the most senior members of your field, but people who would be likely to be available to review your paper. But in addition, I think challenges that have not been raised are in reviewing interdisciplinary papers, getting people with the right breadth of expertise to cover all different aspects of a paper, and ensuring from an editorial perspective that kind of all parts of a paper have been adequately reviewed. And then lastly, I think also as a kind of across science, we need to also realize that, you know, people's time is part of the reason that we're struggling to find reviewers, is that people are struggling to find the time. And so we need to think as widely about other ways to recognize or reward peer review service.
Thank you. And moving on to the next question now. So when authors get reviews, sometimes they're overwhelmed by the number of requests reviewers have today. Can you share your thoughts on how to navigate responding to peer reviews? Again, Colin, you'll get to go first, and then Diane, and then Christina.
Okay. Yeah, so I did sort of address this in my initial comments, but so at the Journal of Virology and many ASM journals, you know, that we do have specific instructions for the reviewers not to, you know, we basically ask people to review the paper in front of them. You know, is this, you know, acceptable work or not? And as Diana said, you know, don't just think of like the ideal experiment that I would do, which is going to double the amount of work and figures and stuff. You know, so, you know, we rely on the on the authors to, you know, show us their work. It should be complete. You know, we often, you know, there's sort of this cliche that it's, you know, 6 to 9 figures, and these days, you know, some supplementary data that supports those figures. And so, you know, there is a separate section in our reviewing, you know, template, which is for, you know, potential additional experiments. And so I think, you know, again, look at those. You know, the idea is to make, you know, identify major flaws, and if they can be addressed relatively easily in 1 or 2 experiments, then the reviewers can make that suggestion. My sort of rule of thumb is that if 2 reviewers point out the same problem, then that's pretty much something that you should, you know, it's probably an issue that needs to be fixed. If one reviewer says something about it and the other ones don't, then, you know, look at it again. And you know, often, you know, I mean, my papers have often been improved by the reviewers' comments and making the changes that were requested, even if it involves additional experiments. But we're not in the business of, you know, doubling the size of a paper or making people do, you know, exhaustive year-long additional experiments. And so, you know, look at what's reasonable. If you can address something quickly, then do that. If you can't, or if it's a comment or suggestion that doesn't really improve the work significantly, then, you know, get back to the editor. As I said, the editor makes the decision, and they can explain, you know, which parts of the review are essential and which parts aren't, or at least most editors try to do that.
Thank you, Colin. Diana?
Right. So as an author, I used to treat peer reviewers as preaching the gospel. And so every single comment that a peer reviewer made, I addressed it. I did everything that they said I should do. And having participated in the process of peer review as a peer reviewer, I now understand that this process should actually be more of a conversation. And so, you know, you can imagine like someone sitting at the other end of the table with a cup of coffee telling you, I think you need to do these things to make this paper better. And, you know, having no fear about telling your colleague, well, I don't think I need to do that because of this, this, and that. And, you know, this analysis stands on its own legs because of X, Y, and Z. And then actually having that conversation. And so now I know that it's possible and actually common for authors to respond to peer reviewers in this way. So basically supporting an argument to say whether or not something should or should not be done in a particular way.
Thank you, Diana. Christina?
So from the perspective of microbiology spectrum, we provide some guidance in terms of timeframes to our reviewers and editors, which is that in kind of making a recommendation for a paper, they should think about the kind of time involved for revision not exceeding 2 to 3 months. And if what they're recommending for experiments or additional work would take more than that, then the paper should probably be rejected, that there's more work that would be needed than we would want to be recommending and asking the authors to do. So then we feel like then that kind of puts a bound around what additional work is being put on the authors for revision for our journal, and some boundaries around that. But I would agree with what Diana had just said as well, that even within that, there is some room for looking at what the reviewers have said, and importantly, what the editor might have highlighted in their comments as well, to think about what might be essential and what you feel is essential to improve the paper.
I just want to quickly
Sure, go ahead, Colin.
to say that there are journals which you're all aware of, which may demand and often expect more experiments. Where we're mainly talking about, ASM journal expectations. And if you're going to another journal, that these may not apply in exactly the same way. So you need to understand where you're submitting.
That's a fair point, but overall, really, scope is really is something to think about when responding to reviews. What is within scope and what is outside the scope of the current study needs to be sort of something you as an author think about a lot and make that decision and make that call. And it's the author's call much more than the reviewer's call. Diana, there's a lot of questions in the chat about co-reviewing. So I'm going to ask you, how does co-reviewing compare to now actually providing independent peer reviews?
Right. So co-reviewing, I felt a little bit frantic, so I wasn't entirely sure whether or not the things that I was writing I felt whether or not they were actually important or valuable. I didn't understand that journals each have their own scope, and that, as we're reviewing for a manuscript, we need to look at the journal scope and how that paper fits into it, and then whether or not our comments are in line with the journal scope. And so I think, co-reviewing, I was probably reviewer number 2. I said everything that came across my mind about what needed to improve. And I would say in some of the reviews I did independently before the junior editorial board, I probably was also reviewer number 2. And in the process of learning actually about journal scope, and then this idea that peer reviewers should really be evaluating scientific rigor, I have really reformulated the way that I think about what peer reviewers, what the role that they play in science.
Thank you. And I think a lot of our audience is actually from outside the US today. And as the scientific landscape evolves, we as publishers want to be inclusive. Journal boards often have editors based in the US and not sufficient representation from other countries. So the real challenge is increasing sort of representation on our boards and also in the reviewer pool as well. So Colin, could you share your thoughts about how to solve this problem of getting folks from outside the US to participate in the boards and the peer review process itself?
Yes, no, I think this is an important part of our role. And as I suggested, one way would be, for you to volunteer. I mean, if you have the experience and you want to participate. Another thing is findability. In other words, there are certain names of people in science who are, very common. And so again, if there's some way to identify that, a reviewer, for example, if you make a suggestion, that's always helpful. Emails are often a sort of unique identifier. So ORCID numbers for most, many people who have been active in science have those numbers. And so I think that would help us to sort of, make sure we can, for example, check Google Scholar or PubMed or whatever, to make sure that people, have the background and experience to do the reviewing that we hope they'll be able to do. That would be, one of my suggestions.
Thank you, Colin. Christina, Spectrum has done a lot of work here. Do you want to share a little bit about how it is to launch a new journal and sort of have DEI as a central thing in building a global board?
So for Spectrum, we had this unique opportunity of at the relaunch, we could build the board from the ground up, and we did this through some invitations, but largely through an open process where anyone could apply to join Spectrum's editorial board. And so through that, we were able to build a very geographically diverse editorial board. We have editors from over 15 countries and reviewers from over 95 countries. And I think remarkably, we've only been peering recently into our diversity of our reviewer pool, and really been what we found is that only a third of our reviewers are from the United States, 15% are from China, and the remaining 50% are from the rest of the world. So this, I think, reflects the diversity of our editors and of the papers that we're receiving, to now also begin to see the diversity of the reviewers from where they're coming from. I think we still have some work to do to look look at what ASM is building of demographic information of people to be able to look at that. But it's a start, and yeah, we want to be able to kind of closely follow this, because this is important to be able to look at this.
Thank you, Christina. Before we move to questions, just one correction. I heard the word 50 is 15. So Spectrum has editors from over 50 countries in total, not 15. So it's a much more diverse geographical pool of editors. So do we want to move to questions, Lorraine or Adriana?
Yes, we received a lot of questions. Maybe to get started, there was one question at the beginning, maybe just summarizing, what are 3 good points a reviewer must consider during the review of a scientific paper?
I don't know who wants to take, I can take that initially. So I would say, make sure, so as a reviewer, I sometimes summarize, in 2 or 3 sentences what the work was about. What's the topic? That sort of frames it in my mind, and also gives the editor a sense of what this paper is actually addressing. The second thing to consider would be the novelty, and is this work that's been published before exactly or very, very similarly? In which case, that might, make it, it's nice to have confirmatory work, but if it doesn't have some novelty or innovation, then, that's a concern. And then I think, the sort of, the question is, has the question that's being addressed been actually, addressed by, or the questions being asked addressed by the experiments? And do they sort of give you some, new information? So in Journal of Virology, we pretty much say that, the paper has to have some hypothesis. It needs to address a point, and that point needs to be sort of covered by the research that's being performed. I think that would be the main things that you're looking at. And then other technical flaws. Is there a method or an approach that is basically, not doing the job that the authors think that it's doing, and that would raise a concern about the work being presented in terms of the rigor and sort of impact.
I would agree with with a lot of what Colin was saying, but the comment about novelty is the place that differentiates microbiology spectrum, which is the journal where we do not consider perceived novelty or impact, which can be a little bit of a subjective criteria that the editors can have different opinions on. So that's a place where if papers that you submit to one ASM journal, if that's the reason why the paper is, for example, not being considered there, then microbiology spectrum becomes a good option for your paper.
And just from a more junior perspective, I approach it from a more nuts and bolts. So the 3 to 4 things that I will tackle on reviews, I'll go through the figures and make sure that I think that the statistics are correct, that, the number of samples is adequately described in, the figure legends or the text, so that the statistics are right. And then secondly, whether or not the methods are correct and whether there are any violations of assumptions of methods that are being used. And then thirdly, whether or not the paper is adequately reproducible. In my comments to the editors, if I don't feel comfortable assessing whether something is not super novel or significant, I will make that note in the note to the editors. And since I am still pretty junior and learning the scope of the field.
Thank you. That's an important point. There's most reviews is always a section for note to the editor that the authors don't get to see. So that is something when you become an editor is something to look out for. That you do get some private notes from the reviewer that sort of help you make the decision as an editor on whether to reject or modify or what to exactly convey to the author. So Ryan, did you want to move to the next question, or Christina, did you have something else to add? No.
Yeah, so just in general, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A about how to get started as a peer reviewer and, what should you do, especially as a graduate student. So yeah, any advice you have around that, I think the audience would appreciate.
I think it's a great chance to talk about co-reviewing from all perspectives, actually.
Yeah, Christina, do you want to take that one, or Diana? I can address it, but maybe you have more experience.
So I would say that the things that I've done are tell the people within my network, hey, I would like to be a peer reviewer. So when you get a request that you reject, maybe submit my name and email. And because you can be assured that your PI and your committee members and other mentors that you have are getting way more review requests than they want to contend with. And then secondly, look out for these opportunities to sign up for junior editorial boards, which may have different names at different journals, but which are expanding across the universe of scientific publishing. And then finally, do some reading on peer review to kind of familiarize yourself with what some of the larger problems are. And you can find courses on how to approach tackling a peer review. The Nature Master Class has a course. The American Chemical Society has a course on peer review. And I think those are both good places to start.
I forgot to say when I was talking about finding peer reviews is if I ask someone, particularly a senior virologist or, well-known scientist, to be a reviewer, I always put in a comment saying, if you can't do it, if you can suggest someone who is both willing and able and, qualified to do the review. And so that might be a senior postdoc or even a grad student who's, a senior grad student. And then, that person will, often check in with the senior person so that way we can, they can learn, the peer review process, like Diana said, but, have sort of some advice about the process as well. So if you are interested in doing it, you reach out to someone and say, I'm willing to work with you as a peer reviewer, and that will often, help everyone to get in the process.
Another resource is that some papers now have published their reviews alongside the paper, and that might be an opportunity where maybe you and a group of your fellow students could take that paper and think about how you might review it yourself, and then go look and see what the reviews were that were published alongside the paper, as a exercise or a journal club to discuss. So it's not exactly the same as submitting a review yourself, but it's an opportunity to see how you might have reviewed it, and what the reviewers said about the paper when it was reviewed before it was revised.
Lorraine, we probably have time for just one last question. So what is our last question going to be?
Yeah, there was a question when as an author, someone is submitting a paper and they're in the process of thinking about reviews to suggest, what are some considerations they should take into account when they suggest reviewers?
Well, and Christina may have more details about what they do in M Spectrum, but we have an editorial board, and that is I believe it's required that you nominate some people from the editorial board. I would say people who are experts, have published in your area, but are not collaborators, so if you've co-published with them, that's probably not going to be, at least recent, particularly recently, in a scientific study, then that's probably a conflict of interest. But if you know people in your discipline, and you know them probably much better than the editors do, suggest them, and make sure you have like their identifier, so that we can make sure that we know who it is, and we can check on their background and stuff. So
Yeah, I would add people who are, again, not the most senior people in the field, who are likely to be unavailable, although sometimes they might recommend junior members of their group. I think the main thing is to suggest people, to think about suggesting not just a couple, but 4 or 5 is a good number.
6, 7, or 8, it's not too many. You'd be surprised, sometimes how often people turn you down.
And to suggest people who are well suited to the study that is being submitted.
Diana?
Oh, apologies. I was responding to some of the questions, some of the questions live. I don't have anything else to add.
I would say, as publishers, we pay a lot of attention to conflicts of interest. So please be very careful on who you recommend, because we do pay attention to that, as do the editors. So that's something to bear in mind when recommending someone. And as Colin and Christina mentioned, appropriate expertise is really important, and it makes the editor's lives a lot easier if there is someone you recommend who's appropriate. Now, the journal has a junior board like in bio, and you see someone with the right expertise there, recommend them, because they will take up the review and do the review for you. It'll be quick. So do get to know the journal a little bit before you submit, and that often helps you get a quick review process and a relatively quick turnaround of the journal. So we're about 15 minutes later than we planned to be here. So thank you everyone for attending and signing up for this webinar. It was great to sort of have a conversation today with Christina, Colin, and Diana. We'll have a lot more webinars like this in the future. Thank you everyone for participating, and thank you to our ASM team and to Christina, Colin, and Diana for volunteering for this webinar. Thank you.